antrą pasaulinį, pirmą dalį. Let's go.
Churchill was a man with many talents. He was an artist, a butterfly enthusiast, and he had an unpublished manuscript about aliens. Clearly, he was a man with an insatiable thirst for knowledge. Maybe he could have loaded up his computer and logged onto Skillshare, an online learning community with more than 19,000 classes in design, business, technology, improvers photography. Share. I work heavily with a class full of tips and tricks for creating vector art, or this one for creating character walk cycles. For an annual subscription, Skillshare is under $10 a month. And if you'd like to try it out first, then I've got a deal just for
Kiek čia laiko reklama tęsis? Okay, tai antras pasaulinis.
It's 1902. A young man by the name of Benito Mussolini moves from Italy to Switzerland to avoid military service. He gets big into socialism, working for trade unions, writing for socialist newspapers, advocating a violent overthrow of European monarchies, the whole shebang. This gets him in a bit of trouble with the Swiss police, so he gets arrested, sent back to Italy, set free, returns to Switzerland, is arrested again, completes his military service after previously avoiding it, and then after a brief stint as an elementary school teacher, he finally returns to work as an avid socialist. His speeches and journalistic abilities made him famous among Italian socialists. He was anti-war, so when Italy colonized Libya in 1910, he rioted and got arrested. Then World War I came along, and once again he protested Italy's involvement. But then he thought, wait a minute, this war could bring about the social climate needed to overthrow European monarchies and bring about the socialist revolution everywhere. And suddenly he was pro-war, but his fellow socialists didn't like his new pro-war stance, so they kicked him out of the party. So then he said, you know what, I'm done with socialism. We need something new, not based on class divisions tearing us apart, but based on unity through nationality. We'll conquer the Mediterranean and reunite all Italian peoples just like the days of the Roman Empire. I'll call it fascismo, and it will guide the Italian nation to greatness. That's all well and good, Mr. Mussolini, but what kind of haircut am I giving you? Let's go with... bold.
Šitas editinimas daug. Normalu.
Italy had been on the winner's side in World War I, and they hoped they were going to get a lot out of it, but in the end, they only got a little, and they felt cheated. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that the Italian people were a little unhappy. So when Mussolini came along and said that he could fix everything, his fascist movement gained a lot of support. In 1922, he went to the king and said, make me prime minister, or I'll make me prime minister. And the king said, you and what army? This army. Fair enough. Then he went about establishing...
Tai pala, tai Mussolinis realiai per jėgą paėmė valdžią, prime minister poziciją? Nu, čia taip implaino.
A dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had its first fascist dictator. Next up, Germany. Germany had been on the loser's side, and they got absolutely wrecked by the Treaty of Versailles. They lost territory, had to demilitarize the Rhineland, had to reduce their army to just 100,000 men, couldn't have an air force, had to pay the Allies a huge amount of money that it didn't have, and a new rule was established that every Englishman withheld the right to walk into the center of Berlin, pick out any German they wanted, and spank the hell out of them.
Turbūt pamoka, kad jeigu kažkas pralaimi karo, negalima tiek uždėti baudų, kad jiem neliktų nieko kito, kaip tiesiog vėl eit kariauti, aš nežinau. Bet, I guess, jie neturi su ko tada jau kaip, bet jo, įdomu kaip ten gavosi tom, kas nors, jo, čia nepaaiškina, bet įdomu kaip ten gavosi, kai vokiečius privertė mokėti, I guess, kitiems, kaip pasakė, pinigų, kur neturėjo.
That last one up, but it helps you understand how all this felt to Germans. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that when a small angry man with a silly mustache came along and said that he could fix everything...
No, tipo, ta pati problema, tipo, daug problemų yra valstybėje, tipo, ir tada ateina populistas toks, nu, nežinau, ar populistas, nu, bet tipo, tos žada gerus dalykus, aš viską sutvarkysiu, viską išspręsiu, tipo, ir visi, okei, davai, darom taip, teisingai. Ką čia tarti su tais duchais, einam šaudytis, nu, tipo, what the fuck.
The German people loved it. Hitler had been a soldier during World War I, and he was crazy patriotic, and nobody was madder than him about Germany's humiliation. He helped start a new political party, and in 1923 attempted a march on Munich with his boys. And then he got arrested. But his popularity grew and grew, and in 1933, the president made him chancellor. He believed he was Germany's great destined savior, and he went full megalomaniac, establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had fascist dictator number 2. Hitler and Mussolini had a lot of the same ideas, but more importantly, they had the same enemies, and they started to get along. Anyone else want to be friends? Franco? No? You good? I do. Who's that? It's Japan, and they've taken over northern China. Let's rewind a bit. Japan had isolated itself from the rest of the world for over 200 years until the Americans showed up and said, you're going to trade with us and you're going to like it. Then the Western powers imposed a bunch of unequal treaties, meaning Japan's economy was bust. They also had no natural resources, so they decided to go get some. They went to war with China to gain a sphere of influence over Korea, and they took a bunch of China's stuff. But then the West said, hey, cut that out. And since Japan couldn't take on the West, they said, okay, I guess we'll just go home. Wait.
Įdomu, kaip čia parodys atominės bombos, kai galų gale bus ant šito mapo, bus greičiausiai viena, tada, žinai, maža pauzė, tada antra, tokiu tradiciniu stilium to timingo.
A minute, what are you doing? Taking advantage of a weakened China and setting up spheres of influence. But I was the one who weakened them. We know. And you guys didn't let me have anything. We know. That seems unfair.
We know.
We don't think so.
Oh.
Okay, see ya. So Japan thought, screw this, and went to war with Russia, and stunned everyone by actually winning. Then they fully annexed Korea, but they didn't stop there. In World War I...
Wait, Japan annexed Korea? What the fuck? What the fuck? O dabar Japonija su Koreja, tipo, all good, chill, ar dar turi tokią priešpriešą, kaip mes prieš Rusus, ar per trumpai čia tęsis, the fuck? Aš šitą nežinojau. Gal ten trumpai buvo, aš nežinau.
They took Germany's colonies and islands in Asia, and then in an incident that was maybe staged by the Japanese army, a bomb blew up a Japanese train in Manchuria, giving them an excuse to launch an invasion and take over. So here's the situation. Nazi Germany giving them an excuse to launch an invasion and take over. So here's the situation.
Šitas humoras man patinka, toks labai subtilus ir trumpas, kurva, kokia ta laida buvo idiotiška, my god.
Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Japan all believe they're racially superior, all feel hostility towards the Allies, and all want to militarize and take over more stuff. And so they did. Let's start with Germany. Hitler hated the Treaty of Versailles, and now he was ready to begin undoing it. In complete violation of the treaty, the first Luftwaffe squadrons were set up, conscription was introduced, and he pimped up his army. The Allies did nothing.
Pačia Gustav? Ar čia tas buvo...
were set up, conscription was introduced, and he...
Ar čia tas Gustav Cannon? Kaip jis vadinosi? Gustav Gun? Jo, Schwerer Gustav, Heavy Gustav. Railway Gun is fucking sick. Toks, aš apie jį žiūrėjau atskirą video. Okay, never mind, žiūrim toliau.
Pimped up his army. The Allies did nothing. Then Hitler sent his army back into the demilitarized Rhineland, giving orders to immediately retreat if the Allies showed up. The Allies did nothing. With his military re-strengthened, he could now move on to step 2. He wanted to rapidly increase the Aryan population, and to do so, he needed Lebensraum. Or in other words, he would have to take over the world. But for now, a good portion of Europe would do, and he began eyeing up his neighbors. The Allies finally started to get worried, so they implemented a fairly useless diplomatic strategy called appeasement, and it went a little something like this. Hitler would say, I want that thing, and the Allies would say, you can't have that thing. Okay, you can have that thing, but no more. I want that thing. And repeat. In 1938,
čia ta gera pamoka, kad jo duosi centimetrą, niekad nesustos.
Austria, and just took it, with no resistance. Boom, this is Germany now. Next, he demanded to be given the Sudetenland, an area of Czechoslovakia with many ethnic Germans. The Allies held a meeting with Hitler in Munich and said, look, we're going to give you what... Hang on, this meeting is about my territory. Shouldn't I come to the meeting too? Anyway, we're going to give you what you want. Really? Yeah. Just like that? Yep. What's the catch? Just sign this piece of paper promising you won't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. Okay. Then Chamberlain returned home victorious, waving his signed piece of paper in the air.
It is invading Czechoslovakia.
The continuation of world peace, and we built a statue of Chamberlain in his honor. And every day on the 30th of September, we celebrate Chamberlain Day. Hitler's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia.
Tas setupas jau taip patinka šitas humoro, jau humoro tipas, žinai, tokios, naudoja, gan tradicinius tos tropus, bet I like them. Okay, tai pasirodo žmonės mėgino, taigi, tarti su Hitleriu. Palauk, kodėl niekas bendrai lygina? Bendrai jo lygina daug kas Putiną su Hitleriu. Nes tipo čia, tie visi, kur proputinistiški žmonės. Reikia tarti su Putinu. Kada tarimasis su šitais urodais padėjo? Kada ever padėjo tarimasis? Niekada nepadėjo.
What? He's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. Oh. You lied to me. What do you expect? I'm Hitler. Not to be outdone, Mussolini also wanted to get in on the action. He thought to himself, isn't there a not yet colonized nation somewhere which is so underdeveloped that the people would be defending themselves against our tanks with literal bows and arrows and wooden spears? Oh, there is? Fantastic. And so he took it. Italy also wanted to control the entrance to the Adriatic Sea, so they occupied Albania. Then, in another incident which was maybe staged by the Japanese, gunfire was exchanged by Japanese and Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge, and the Japanese launched yet another invasion against China. They swept through Beijing and Shanghai, and then advanced through the Yangtze Valley to China's then capital, Nanking. It was here that saw the worst of Japan's shocking atrocities committed against the Chinese people. Back in Europe, Germany and Italy made their relationship status official by signing the Pact of Steel. Then, Hitler turned his eyes towards Poland and the hated Polish corridor, splitting Germany in two. At this point, the Allies really had to put their foot down, and they warned him that an invasion of Poland would mean war. Hitler had planned to continue his advance eastward, but he didn't want to end up fighting a war on two fronts. So for now, he made an alliance with Stalin, saying, how about we both invade Poland and split it between the two of us, and I definitely...
O, čia kur jūs pasakojate tą jo. Kur mes kai žiūrėjom tą video jo apie Antrą pasaulinį, kur per tą laiką jūs papasakojat, kad ten Rusija apie tai nešneka jo, kad jie Poland invadino.
Refrain from not betraying you sometime in the future.
Kad susitarė su Hitleriu kažkaip ten taip jo.
Sounds...
Tai čia actually susitarė.
Good. This new alliance stunned the West. On the 1st of September 1939, German troops entered Poland, and Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Poles fought hard, but they were no match for the two giants crashing down from either side. Then came a period known as the Phony War, where everyone just sort of sat around not doing much. The French had launched a small invasion into the Saarland, but they maintained mostly defensive positions, and after a while decided to just turn around and call it a day. Speaking of France, the French were still super proud of their victory in World War I, and they hadn't really moved on from it. They still used horses, they dispatched messages by motorbike instead of using radio, orders from the commander-in-chief were usually pretty vague, and the troops were rarely inspected.
Ai, čia šitas būtent, čia ir buvo tas pasidalinimas, tas Ribbentropo-Molotovo paktas, jo, kur puola Polandą ir tada pasidalina tipo šalis tas teritorijos, jo, bet tai iš čia.
They built a line of defenses along their were usually pretty vague, and the troops were rarely inspected.
I literally can't even see right now, Lamavo, o jums tas užstoja. Ne, čia kur mano kamera. Why are we speaking English, lol? Ja, paktas, kiek aš žinau jo, iš istorijos, kiek pamenu, tai buvo slaptas, paskui jis ten atkastas ar kažkaip ten pavieštas, buvo, aš net nežinau šito, bet jo. O, wow, Emilija streamina, pamačiau netyčia. Ohoho. Kas čia per karalienę grįžo po 16 metų pertraukos? Look at this. Ir pakibo man streamas ar kas čia? Ai, ne, nepakibo, gerai. Jesus, jinai tai kaip pilnas menulis. Gerai, šium toliau.
They built a line of defenses along their German border, but didn't bother extending it all the way to the Channel, and they wouldn't launch artillery strikes against Germany out of fear of being retaliated against. In a war, they didn't want to attack the enemy. And at first the UK wasn't much better. Chamberlain still naively hoped that the war could be ended diplomatically. Instead of bombing raids, the RAF dropped propaganda leaflets over German cities, which one air marshal said likely did nothing but provide the continent with toilet paper for the duration of the war. They also only sent 200,000 men to France, while the French had mobilized millions. Both Britain and France wanted to avoid a repeat of the First World War, and so they wanted to keep the war as far from home as possible. So they turned their eyes north, towards Norway. Neutral Sweden was exporting...
Dar viena pamoka turbūt, kai nori, kad karas būtų kuo toliau ir tiesiog, kaip čia ignoruoji, galų gale karas ateis ir pas tave įgės, taip visą laiką būna, tai todėl čia gal taip ir suinteresuoti visi, kad dabar karas actually all in būtų Ukrainoje ir kad visi taip nori padėti, kad jis actually nejudėtų, kad rusai tenais būtų pralošę. Gal tokia pamoka? I don't know, čia aš belenką kalbu. Okay, žiūrėjom toliau.
Iron ore to Germany through neutral Norway. So the Allies asked them if they could...
Nes tipo čia, mintis čia buvo, kad pasiuntė mažai karių, kai ten keliasšimtus tūkstančių, tai taip atmestinai, žinai. Tarsi čia, karas ten toli bus, tai pas mus neteis, bet visą laiką pas jūs ateis. Tipo, jeigu šalis agresorė, tipo, ta, kuri parodė, kad, tiesiog gali pult kitą šalį, jeigu tu jas nesustabdai iš karto vietoj, žingsnis po žingsnio. Paims centimetrą, norės metro. Okay.
Stop exporting iron ore to Germany, but this request was refused. Then the Soviet Union attacked Finland. So the Allies said, how about we land troops in Norway and move them across Sweden to go help out your good pal Finland, and along the way maybe take control of all your armfields. But Norway and Sweden still said no. So the UK mined the waters around Norway to force any transport ships into international waters, and they also attacked a German tanker they found in the area. Hitler realized what the Allies were up to, and he quickly moved to secure his supply of iron ore. He launched an invasion through Denmark into Norway. The Allies rushed to land troops at key ports along the coast, but Germany had taken control of Norway's airfield, and their air superiority decided the fight. The Allies had to retreat. After this slightly embarrassing failure, Chamberlain resigned and was replaced with Winston Churchill, who had a slightly different approach to dealing with the Germans. Hitler's overall strategy was similar to Germany's First World War strategy. Attack France, defeat France, knocking out the UK in the process, then turn on the Soviet Union and win the war. During the phony war, the Allies had given Hitler time to prepare his forces. Now, he was ready to attack. The Allies had wanted to place troops in Belgium, but Belgium had refused, and in a move that surprised pretty much no one, Hitler launched an invasion to get around France's defenses. The Allies charged into Belgium at full speed to meet the German invasion head-on, and it looked like a repeat of the First World War was coming. But this time, Hitler had a trick up his sleeve. Blitzkrieg. As the Germans advanced, they sent thousands of refugees westward, slowing down the Allies. Then, to the south, the French had left the Ardennes, an area full of hills and forests, pretty underdefended because they thought it was naturally impenetrable. Well, the Germans were about to penetrate it with everything they had. They smashed 50 Wehrmacht divisions through and encircled the Allied armies at lightning speed. The best of the Allied forces were now trapped. The Germans squeezed in from all sides, taking out France's best armies and nearly wiping out the British too. But they managed to make a desperate last-minute escape at Dunkirk, with British civilians...
Dunkirk, čia filmas buvo toks, pala. Dunkirk. Apie tą dvikovą, jo, 17 metų Nolano. Gan aukštai vertintas, čia būtent apie tą Last Standą ir buvo, I guess. Okay, cool.
Making the perilous journey to bring their young men home. With most of the French forces depleted, the Germans breezed through, taking Paris, and France fell. What the Germans couldn't do in World War I, Hitler had done just like that. Hitler hoped that with the fall of France, the UK would also lose hope and sue for peace.
Iš tikrųjų, gan fascinating, čia, tipo, paėmė visą Prancūziją, žinai. Okay, what the fuck, per kiek laiko čia paėmė, aš nežinau tiksliai, bet, taip, mastai teritorijos, kurią paėmė. Tada Rusai puolė Ukrainą ir metus už Bahmutą kovoja ir už ten 5 kilometrus į priekį. Tipo, neįtikėtini skirtumai, žinai, aišku, labai skiriasi karai ir technologija turbūt, bet nors sakė, kad dabar Ukrainoje kariauja kaip antram pasauliniam ten trench warfare, tai I don't fucking know. Bet jo, dabar palygint progresas koks lėtas ir kaip šičia, aišku, nežinau, čia per kiek laiko, nes čia, nerodo datų, žinai, bet taip tiesiog pramušė frontą, žinai, visos šalis paimtos, okei.
But quite annoyingly, it didn't. And he
bendrai, I guess bendrai, jeigu Rusam būtų viskas pagal planą, pačioj pradžioj, ten Kievą paima, Zelenskį nušauna ten ir panašiai, tai gal ir būtų taip, kad iš vidaus tipo tas visas, tipo techniškai okupuotas šalis.
Eastern Front, so he tried to force them into submission with mind games. The UK were now all alone, and Hitler wanted to emphasize that. First of all, just before France fell, Italy finally declared war on the Allies, making the UK's situation even worse. Next, instead of just occupying all of France, Hitler occupied the coastal areas for defense, but allowed France to continue its existence as a German puppet state. This way, it looked like the UK's old ally had decided to switch sides. Hitler also hoped that the UK wouldn't attack any of her old allies' navy bases or colonies in Africa, giving Hitler an extra line of defense to the south, but the UK made sure to respond to this by sailing down to France's navy base in Algeria and wrecking a bunch of ships. So have at it. Hitler then began laying down plans for an invasion of Great Britain before German troops could land on British soil.
Gerai, šitas nepavyko. Šitas žinau, kad nepavyko. Ne? Pala, man Freddy, mes esam su Freddy 1-2, kai LOL žaidėm, kažką šnekėjo apie tai. Na, čia visų pirma, blet, ir persikelti čia fucking insane sunku turėtų būti, bet jo.
Superiority across the channel. Waves of German bombers came while the completely outnumbered RAF worked bravely around the clock in an attempt to quell the German attacks. At first, the Luftwaffe targeted British ports and coastal facilities. Then it attacked RAF bases, crippling the RAF's ability to defend the nation. And it looked like Hitler's great British invasion was coming. But then, Churchill ordered a small, pretty insignificant bombing raid over Berlin. It didn't do much damage, but Hitler was furious, and he immediately ordered the Luftwaffe to refocus its attacks on civilian targets in London. Children were sent off to the countryside away from their parents to avoid danger, and frequent trips to air raid shelters became a daily occurrence. But British morale held firm. Smiling, knitting, lounging casually, these people this refocusing on London also gave the RAF breathing space to reorganize, so Hitler kind of shot himself in the foot there. Just the foot for now. Finally, the Luftwaffe sent
foreshadowing,
and the RAF successfully repelled it, destroying many of the German aircraft and placing air superiority firmly in British hands. Hitler's invasion had to be postponed, but the bombing of British cities continued for some time.
Ok, antra dalis. Beje, antram pasauliniam, pataisykite, jeigu klystu, bet man atrodo, antioro sistemos buvo daug prastesnės, jo, todėl lėktuvai tiesiog galėdavo bombinti ten miestus ir tos kovos ore vykdavo. Nes kažkaip aš tokį, nežinau, čia aš gal iš Ukrainos tos situacijos dariau tokį įspūdį, kad dabar ore kovoti yra gan, kaip čia, rizikinga ir brangu, nes jeigu antioro sistemos dabar, kaip suprantu, yra labai geros, ir, lėktuvai patys daug brangiau kainuoja, tipo, jeigu numuša tavo lėktuvą su ten, nežinau, kažkokią raketą daug labiau apsimoka, tipo, nežinau, ar čia iš vis teisybė, bet, tipo, tai jo akis buvo antioro sistema. Ai, įgėsio technologija dar nebuvo tiek, tai turbūt. Ir įdomiausia, šiaip nuo viduramžių Anglai garsėjo galingų jūrų laivynų, o čia dar ir ore gerai pavarėm. Interesting. Ok. Fainas video. Antrą dalį varom, let's go.
It was made possible by Skillshare, an online learning community. Stick around.
Antra dalis.
So what else is happening? Well, when I said Britain was all alone, that wasn't entirely true. Many Commonwealth nations and other allied colonies had joined the war in Britain's support. They would play a key role throughout the war, particularly in the African and Italian campaigns. On the Axis side, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the defensive tripartite pact, bringing their military alliance even closer together. The Soviet Union's war against Finland should have been an easy victory, but it became a humiliating struggle, and their military ineptitude was put on full display. In the end, they did force the Finns to sue for peace. Then, they continued their honorable campaign of pushing around much smaller countries by annexing the Baltic states and part of northern Romania. France's colonies in equatorial Africa were like, heck no, we aren't going to join the Germans.
Apie žiemos karą žiūrėjau jau apie tą Samohają, kaip ten tas sniperis, kur buvo tas, apie tą žiūrėjom, dar jo tai jau girdėjęs apie tą biškai.
And they all pledged their allegiance.
Ir šiaip ten jo, paskui žiūrėjau, kai Finlandį NATO paėmė, tai aš žiūrėjau apie jų ten apskritai ir kariuomenės situaciją, ir ten jų pasiruošimą, ir jo, apie tą winter karą, žiemos karą, tipo jo biškuką pažiūrėjau. Kieti Finai.
To free France, except for Gabon, which had to be taken by military force. The Allies also tried to capture the strategic port of Dakar, but that ended in failure. Mussolini had seen Hitler's successes, and he thought now it was Italy's time to shine. So he tried to take British Somaliland, and that went pretty well. Then he tried to take Egypt, and that went less well. Then he tried to take Greece, and that went really badly. Churchill began referring to Italy as Europe's soft underbelly. He began favoring a military campaign from the south and started sending British troops to Greece. All of this had Hitler pretty concerned, and he moved to protect his southern flank. He had been getting friendly with Hungary and twisted their arm into signing the Tripartite Pact and joining the Axis powers. Romania was also eager to join for protection against the Soviet Union. The Tripartite Pact was designed to prevent any other countries from deciding to join the Allies, specifically Britain's old ally, the pesky United States of America. When war first broke out, American public opinion was strongly against joining in. In 1940, there was an election. The Republican candidate said, "I will not send any young Americans to die in Europe." And sitting President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "I will also not send any young Americans to die in Europe. Unless I have to, then I might." And Roosevelt won. Churchill asked him to join the war, but Roosevelt said, "No can do, Winston. But you know what? Here, have some weapons." America began supplying the Allies with food and munitions, but there was one problem. German U-boats were sinking thousands of Allied supply ships in the Atlantic, including American ones. If the Germans could sever Britain's supply line, the UK would starve. Throughout the war, the Allies had to come up with better technology to fight the U-boats. Improved radar, aircraft with longer range, better weaponry and convoy tactics. At one point, a man even called a meeting and said, "Pykrete. You take some wood, you take some ice, you put them together, you get pykrete." And then he pulled out a gun and shot some wood and it shattered. And then he shot some pykrete and the bullet ricocheted off it and hit someone else in the conference room. Then they tried to make a pykrete aircraft carrier, but that idea was scrapped because that's a really dumb idea. In the end, Alan Turing and his team of codebreakers cracked Germany's Enigma code, and the U-boats gradually became less and less of a threat.
Žiūrėjom mes yra video, kaip tas Turing mašina veikia. Man fascinating video va, jinai. Fascinating video, man labai patiko. Bet paskui jo Alanas Turingas nulaužė ten savo hebrantais, ne?
Threat. Back in Africa, Britain decided to push Italy out of Egypt.
Genialu, kad nulaužti.
So they kept going. Hitler realized he was going to have to finally step in and do something. He went to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia and said, "Hey, I'm going to move troops through you to get to Greece. So either join us or, be invaded. Bulgaria opted to join them. Yugoslavia opted to be invaded. Then Greece finally fell to the joint German-Italian invasion. The British had moved troops from North Africa to fight in Greece, which helped Rommel and his tank divisions push the British back to Egypt, and they could have kept going, but a small, mostly Australian force held out under siege for 8 months in Tobruk, denying the Germans a strategic port city and disrupting their...
What the fuck? 8 mėnesius Australai laikė? Afrikos dalį? What the fuck? Egipto čia ką laikė?
And his tank divisions pushed the British back to Egypt, and they could have kept going, but a small, mostly...
Ne, Egiptas čia kažko kito.
The Australian force held out under siege for 8 months in Tobruk, denying the Germans a strategic port city and disrupting their supply line. Despite having some success in the Middle East, the British didn't seem like any real threat for now. Hey, Soviet Union, look out! With 3 million troops, Hitler...
Kaip čia nusprendė istorinį karinį video pažiūrėti, pasidaviau įtakai gerai. Visokiom moterų visokiom čia įtakom. Ne, šiaip komentarė numetė į YouTube komentarus kažkas po video ir galvoju, okay, why not?
Launched the largest ground invasion in history, and Stalin was far from ready. Both Churchill and Roosevelt had warned him of an impending attack, but he dug his head in the sand, and the Soviets...
Iš kur tu tą žinai? Random faktas. Australijoje buvo mėlynojo asbesto kasyklos. How do you fucking know that?
Didn't stand a chance. Germany made staggering progress, with huge encircling movements capturing mind-boggling numbers of Russian troops. 250,000 at Bialystok, Minsk, 300,000 at Smolensk, nearly 700,000 at Kiev, and again at Vyazma and Bryansk. Leningrad was put under a siege that would last an insufferable 4 years. The invasion of Russia had been Hitler's main ideological goal from the beginning, and his hatred for the ethnic peoples there was now unleashed in all its fury. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was brutal for all that endured it. The Germans were now inside of Moscow, and that's it. It's all over. But then it happened. It got cold. Stupid cold. Hitler had hoped the Soviets would give up before winter, but they kept fighting. His commanders came to him and said,
Kaip gerai padarė šitą visą vietą iš tikrųjų. Labai taip ir įtampą išlaiko video ir muzikėlę gerą uždėjo. Labai gerai sueditino kaip su animaciniais tais tipo, bet žiauriai gerai padarė. Aš žinau, kad vokiečiai gan toli buvo nuėję, bet nežinau, kad beveik iki Maskvos dar ir tada tipo sustabdė oras ir panašiai. Žinau, kad oro sąlygos daug karuose nulemdavo tai yra.
Said, can we please dig in for the winter and wait until spring? No, keep going. But oil is literally freezing inside our vehicles.
Čia jis pats savo šovė į kelią, kaip ten rodė ir sakė, kol kas į koją šovė.
That's fine. Keep going. We're having to leave the corpses of our frozen horses by the side of the road so we can still find our way in the snowdrift. Perfectly normal. Keep going. Hitler hadn't given his millions of men winter clothing and supplies because he thought he really should have won by now. Then, Stalin called in troops from the Siberian front, specially trained to fight in the extreme cold. And the Germans were no match. They were now being pushed back. They had no choice but to dig in and wait for winter to end. Germany's victories were staggering, and Japan was eager not to miss the victory bus. Their war in China had come to a standstill, but they wanted to keep expanding their sphere of influence and getting those sweet, sweet raw materials. They began making plans to expand southward, but there was a problem. Southeast Asia was heavily colonized by America and Great Britain. It was also full of ocean. Ocean meant naval combat, and there was no way the Japanese Navy could stand up to the US and the UK. So they thought, wouldn't it...
Čia tipo, nežinau, mes gal šitą karą matom, iš savo perspektyvos. Mums labiau aktualu Europa, Lietuva, žinai, Amerika gal iš tam tikros pusės, ir kam jin ten padeda ir panašiai. Jeigu paklausite, žinai, Japonų ir kaip jie žiūrės kokį video, tai greičiausiai bus iš jų pusės, nes čia kol Hitleris su to, žinai, kovoja visais, jie ten savo dalykus daro ir ten su visais kovoja Japonai, tai yra.
Wouldn't it be nice if we could destroy their navies before we begin our conquest? And so it was. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise air raid on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and inflicted a huge amount of damage. They also attacked British colonies in Southeast Asia. Roosevelt had no choice but to declare war on Japan, and so did Churchill. Hitler then declared war on America, even though he totally didn't have to. The attack on Pearl Harbor seemed like a big Japanese victory, but they didn't attack any of the naval repair yards, fuel storage tanks, or the submarine base, meaning the Pacific Fleet would be up and running again pretty soon. In the meantime, though, the Japanese were able to begin their conquest. They took Guam, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. They forced Thailand to join them so they could march their troops through to Malaya. They swept through Singapore, Borneo, the East Indies, New Guinea, the Solomons, and they were now threatening northern Australia and the borders of India. Japan's victory had been as staggering as the Germans, and it reinforced the Japanese idea that this was a divine war which they were destined to win. But their victories had been based on speed, not power, and power would eventually catch up.
Oh, here we go. Here we go. The big A. Atomo gale. Bet jo, blėt, Nors salas ten, tipo, japonai, kaip suprantant, daug to vandeninio buvo ir salas paėmė, tai, tipo, I guess, ten nėra pats sunkiausias gal dalykas, jeigu tu jau vandenį, nugalėjai, žinai, ir vandenį dominuoji, tai jo, tau atvaryti salą, ten jau apsupi salą, realiai ištarvinį, jie garantuotai tu paimsi ją, bent jau aš taip įsivaizduoju, taip atrodytų gal, kad lengviau biškai.
Shop with them.
Oppenheimeris sakė tą We're all sons of bitches, ar čia kieno tai eilutė buvo iš tikrųjų? Nepamenu, kieno. We are all sons of... Ar kaip jis ten sakė? Oppenheimeris... ne, čia Kennethas Bainbridge'as pasakė, atsisukęs į Oppenheimerį. Rodo šitai buvo.
For now, though, in all occupied nations, the people suffered. Persecution, forced labor, harsh punishments for any who spoke out against their occupiers. In Europe, the Nazis were rounding up ethnic minorities and other unwanted groups and individuals. In particular, millions of Jewish people would suffer through the terrible events of the...
Aš jo dar čia prieš kelias... Reikia daugiau man, aš užsibrėžiau. Aš nieko nežinau apie Izraelio ir Palestinos tą situaciją. Bet aš biškiuką paskaičiau, visiškai mažai paskaičiau, paklausiau ten dar Lino biškai, ten visko. Tai realiai, kiek aš dabar žinau, minimaliai, tai kad po antro pasaulinio, toks tipo, techniškai kaip toks atsiprašymas žydų visų buvo, kad jiems tas Izraelis kažkaip ten buvo sukurta ta jų ta valstybė ir ten su Palestina buvo konfliktas jau nuo to laiko realiai ilgą laiką to, kad Izraelis dar kovojo ten su visom arabų šalim ir visom ten pizdi pakrovė galų gale. Iš Egipto paėmė tą, kaip ten tas pusėsalis, kaip ten tas vadinas, net nepamenu dabar, bet tada galų gale susitarė, atidavė už paliaubą, tai Izraelis parodė, kad realiai istoriškai nori paliaubų su žmonėm ir tiesiog egzistuoti. Tuo tarpu ten aplinkui yra daug tų šalių buvo ir yra, kur daug jų tiesiog nekentė ir nekenčia. Tada Palestinoje atsirado dvi grupuotės, Hamas ir Famas atrodo, kur ten realiai dabar Palestina tapus vos ne tokia kaip semiteroristinė vos ne valstybė, nes ten realiai tos dvi grupuotės paėmusios valdžią ir jos su Izraeliu labai pešasi. Buvo Oslo akordai, kur sutarė pagal tam tikrus sektorius, kur ten jie galės kaip gyventi, bet tas irgi nejudėjo normaliai iš vietos, nes Palestina kaip ir atsisako visų įmanomų būdų tai kaip pasiekti, nors Izraelis ten kaip ir siūlytų, bet jie irgi limituoja ten, kur palestiniečiai galėtų kurtis, kur negalėtų ir ką galėtų daryti, kur negalėtų. Žodžiu, biški daugiau žinau, negu žinojau ten, tarkim, prieš mėnesį atgal, nes tada nieko nežinau, bet ten atrodo fucking mes irgi 100 metų besitrunkantis didžiulis konfliktas, kad ten sunkiai dabar net pasakyti kas kur kaip, bet jo, gerai, žiūrim toliau šitą.
The Holocaust. Brave resistance movements rose up in defiance of their invaders, while the people held out for hope. And hope was coming. Winter was over, and Hitler could continue his push eastward. But this time, he switched up his strategy. He wanted to focus on the south. His plan was to cut off the Russian armies in the Caucasus, an area full of oil, and then invade the Caucasus and take all the oil. His forces moved across the north with ease, and Hitler got shocked. He rerouted the 4th Panzer Army south early, leaving the 6th Army to complete the encircling movement alone. To do so, the 6th Army had to reach and take the key Soviet city of Stalingrad. The Russians defended it fiercely, and Stalingrad saw some of the harshest fighting of the entire war. The Soviets held up the German advance for 5 months as they battled in the war-torn city, which bought them valuable time. When the Germans had first launched their invasion a year earlier, the Soviets had moved their factories to the...
I guess čia tiesiog gal biškiu, kad trūksta man laiko skalės, kad supras, nes, pavyzdžiui, čia 5 mėnesiai truko. Tada, kai jie pasako, pavyzdžiui, gamyklas perkelė, tas užtrunka laiko. Čia greičiausiai buvo... Ne taip, kaip čia, žinai, paveiksliukę parodo, tiesiog paėmė, pajudėjo, aišku, aš tą suprantu, bet būtent kiek laiko užtrunka tie paėmimai, čia jau kitas reikalas, žinai. Čia mėnesiai, metai ir panašiai gali praeiti, kol visas tas, žinai, pajuda.
The east. Those factories had been building a butt ton of tanks and aircraft and getting the Soviet army up to scratch. Now, it was ready. Stalin gathered his new and improved forces around the city, and in an attack that resembled Hitler's own encirclement tactics, they began surrounding the 6th Army. Hitler's commanders came to him and said, "Hey, maybe we should retreat." But Hitler said, "No, you stay."
Uh-oh.
The entire 6th Army was trapped and had to surrender. With complete air superiority, the Soviets started pushing westward. For Stalin, it was a resounding victory. For Hitler, an absolute catastrophe. Things also weren't looking too good for Hitler elsewhere. With America now in the war, Allied bombing over German cities reached devastating levels. In Africa, the British had pushed Rommel back again, then they were pushed back again, and finally, after a decisive battle at El Alamein, and with American and British troops arriving in the west, the Germans and Italians were...
Whoa, what the fuck just happened? What?
With American and British...
Amerika su Britanija tipo atvarė ir tiesiog šitai.
In the west, the Germans and
What the fuck, na? Tiesiog... Kas čia įvyko? Ar ten nebuvo karių ir tiesiog labai staigiai viską paėmė? Nu, aš nežinau per kiek čia laiko vėl, bet čia tiesiog vienu įpu viską. The hell? Nuspalvino, čia kaip su Paint to Fill tool'u tiesiog paėmė mūsų viskas done. Okay.
Facing its rapid success being turned around, they attempted to take the island of Midway, but the US Navy was ready for the attack, and they sank Japan's carrier. Actually, they sank a lot of them. It was a battle from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. British, Indian, and Chinese troops held the line in the harsh jungle terrain of Burma, and the Japanese suffered losses in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. They began to realize they were not invincible. With the Axis out of Africa, the Allies had to decide their next move. Churchill still wanted to attack from the south, while the Americans preferred a full sea invasion in northern France. All right, said the Americans, we'll do it your way. Allied forces successfully landed in Sicily and began moving north. They also carried out bombing raids over Rome. The thing was, many of the people in Sicily had relatives living in America, and they greeted the American troops quite warmly. With the war reaching home territory, most Italians just weren't that into it, and Mussolini was suddenly very unpopular. He was voted out by his own fascist Grand Council and was toppled from power. Italy immediately began negotiations for surrender. Hitler wasn't surprised and had already sent reinforcements southward. In an operation he ironically called Operation Axis, German troops quickly disarmed Italian troops in the north. The Allies continued fighting the Germans up through Italy, but then winter set in, meaning...
Britai su amerikonais visai čia, I guess... Nu jo, I guess, tiek žinojau, bet nežinau gal, kad nuo Afrikos pradėjo, tipo.
Mud, and everything slowed to a halt. All right, said the Americans, let's do it our way as well. Germany had made itself a lot of enemies, and millions of Allied troops had been gathering in England as factories worked around the clock producing the war material needed for a super crazy massive the likes of which the world has never seen before.
Kaip gaila, kaip fucking gaila, tie karai, kiek resursų buvo tiesiog panaudota karui. Karo technikai, kiek žmonių gyvybių tiesiog karui, karo technikai. My God, jeigu mes, kaip padarai iš evoliucijos, būtumėm kažkokių porą dalykų gal neturėję. Ten ir nebūtų to va tokio noro žmonijai vis pastoviai kovoti dėl visko. Gal jau kosmos. O galbūt nebūtumėm iš viso tigrų nugalėję. I don't know. Gal tas bruožas vat, ir buvo ir padarė tą, kad mes technologiškai advansintumėm iki tokio lygio, kur neišvengiamai kariauji, nežinau. Bet atrodo, be karų nebūtų proveržintas, būtų daromas karų tikslais. I doubt that. Tiek resursų. Čia, žinai, kaip čia, su kuo čia palygint? Čia yra labiau silver lining ieškojimas. Bet mes labai puikiai matom, ką žmogus padaro, kai nėra karo. Ir tai yra myliom didesni pasiekimai, ir tipo advancementai. Ir jų daug daugiau, va tame esmė yra. Ten jeigu mes su limituotom lėšom galim ten, nežinau, gravitacinės bangas užfiksuoti ar dar kažką ten. O limituotos lėšos būtent yra dėl to, nes labai daug šalių, karo pramoniai labai daug pinigų išleidžia ten. Tai, nežinau, visą tą, ką pasiekė, galėjo tikrai pasiekti ir man atrodo dar daug greičiau būtų pasiekę, nes būtų didesnis finansavimas, jeigu nereiktų ginkluotis visiems tipo. Tai jo, aš nežinau, čia jo, kai karas yra, technologija advancina, bet jie advancinant, kai nėra karo. Tik aš argumenčiau, kad daug greičiau ir daug plačiau, kaip sakant, platesniuose sferose.
Invasion of Europe. The Germans knew an Allied invasion would come, but they didn't know where it would land. Thanks to Allied deception tactics, they thought there was a pretty good chance it would come at Calais, but the Allies were really going to land in Normandy because it was less fortified.
Ja, suprantat, jūs netaip žiūrit. Visą laiką technologija taikys tam, kam reikia. Pavyzdžiui, kai mes išmokom atomą pažaboti. Nu, žiūrėk, pirma mintis buvo, mums reikia kariauti ir karui ir davai atominį ginklą darom. O kas jeigu, sakau, ta mintis nebūtų pažmonėje? Su atomu vis tiek darė dalykus, taip pat su tranzistoriu. Kaip galim tranzistorių pažaboti ir kais dalykų. O reikia karui, davai darom karui. Jeigu tos minties nebūtų, kad reikia karui, tada būtų sekanti, kam mes galim panaudoti tos tranzistorius. Pasat, telefonai, internetas, visa ta technologija. Čia jūs galvojat, kad, karui padarė tą. Ne, technologija yra, jinai vis atsiranda, kartais ne karo laiku, kartais karo laiku, bet tada ką darysiu su ta technologija, čia yra klausimas. Ir jeigu va, tau visą laiką yra karas, kuris kabo, kuriam reikia ruoštis, tu visą tą technologiją ir pritaikysi karui. Ir aš sakau, mes turim va, tą geną tipo įgęs iš evoliucijos. Jeigu neturėtumėm daug, tai tipo, vis tiek būtų tas progresas ir jisai vyksta. Tiesiog tos dalykus, tą atomo padalinimą, tranzistorius ir su mikročipais mes būtumėm pritaikę kitiems dalykams, žinai. Tam yra galbūt kosmoso eksploracija, galbūt jau Mars ir senai Saulės sistemą būtumėm visą paėmę. Nes ką mums daryti? Kur skirti tos resursus? Davai eksplorinam, researchinam, darom kažką, taip darom, kai karo nėra. Pavyzdžiui, technologiją gerinam žmonių tenais, telefonus, techniką, visą šitą, žinai. Bet, vat, jūs žiūri tą, kad čia tipo vos ne karas buvo dėka karo. Ne, čia silver liningas, o ne pasiekmė, tarkim, tokia, aš bent jau taip sakyčiau.
And the beaches were nicer. Under the careful planning of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion that had been long in the making was just about ready to go. Just one thing was preventing the launch, the British weather. For a short while, everyone sat around waiting for a decent day. And then, it came. On the night of June 5th, over 1,000 bombers took off and raided coastline defenses, while paratroopers were dropped inland in a bit of a chaotic operation, tasked with sabotaging defense.
Karo metu valstybė sako, duos pinigų biržą, reikia efektyviausių daiktų, taikos metu, kas gali pirkti tik vartotojai. Jo, mes viską ir darom dabar vartotojams. Gerai, jūs paskipinat tą pointą. Mokslui proveržiams reikia investicijų, karas lygu didelis koncentruotas fundingas konkretiems pavieniams tyrimams. Jūs neatsikratot ir negalit pažiūrėti tą, jeigu nebūtų to geno ir iš viso net minties, kad reikia karui ruoštis. Jūs negalite įsivaizduoti pasaulio, tarkim, ar žmogaus be to. Nes ir dabar mes duodam pinigų, davai tirkit gravitacinės bangas vėlgi, davai pastatykit kometą, tai yra erdvėlaivį, kad ant kometos nusileisti, Rosetta misija. Ir investuoja ir dabar, bet dabar investuoja gan mažai, nes, pavyzdžiui, ten Amerika, nežinau, ten keli procentai NATO tipo gauna iš biudžeto. Bet karinė technika reikia daug daugiau. Dabar įsivaizduokit pasaulį ar žmogų, kur kariniai technikai nereiktų. Net nereiktų galvoti. O tu tada galėtum gerai, kam tos pinigus skirti, kam tos resursus skirti. Ir jeigu žmonė nuo pat pradžios neturėtų tą, būtų tiesiog biudžetai didesni tų dalykų. Ir tada būtų išsišakojimas ir tas konkretus finansavimas tiem dalykams, o ne karui. Ir tie pats rezultatai, tas pats researchas būtų, aš greičiaus, ne tai, kad greičiau ir geriau, bet dar ir tose pačiose srityse į daugiau tų pusių išsišakoja, į daugiau tų smulkių konkrečių tipo dalykų išsišakoja. Bet jūs viską, ką parašo, tai vis tiek lieka iš tos pusės, kad egzistuoja tas dalykas, kaip va mums reikės įtkariauti, žmonių galvose ir planavime, žinai. O aš apie ką kalbu, tipo, kad jeigu iš viso to geno kažkokio ar kažko žmogus neturėtų, tipo. Nes tie patys dabar kalba dronai, žinai, tranzistoriai, čia lygiai tas pats, ką ir sakiau, tipo, kokia technologija be egzistuotų, iš kur jin bebūtų atsiradus, ją pritaikys tam, kam reikia. Tipo, o karui reikia, okei, pritaikysim karui, okei, bet jeigu tos net minties karo tipo tokio, kaip konflikto tokio, nebūtų, technologija vis tiek atsirastų, žmogus nori skristi. Okei, išradinėjom lėktuvus, sparnus, tada dronai, viskas čia eina natūraliai, neišvengiamai ateis kažkaip. Tik išsišakos gal biškai kitus dalykus į kitas erijas, kaip sakant. Ir mes galbūt dabar turėtumėm ten delivery service jau labai gerai veikiantį su dronais, o ne granatų delivery service, you know. Bet pati ta technologija, aš sakau, jinai adaptuojama, pritaikoma yra labai visą laiką, kam reikia, bet dabar reikia karui, nes nuo žmonijos pradžios mes turim tą geną ir mes kariaujam. Tai tas yra mūsų dalis ir mes turim tam ruoštis. Bet jeigu to nebūtų, man atrodo, visiškai kitur būtume. Arba būtume susnaikinę su kažkokiu nepavykusiu technologijų eksperimentu, I don't fucking know. Gerai, žinom, toliau, sorry, interpas buvo, bet, okay.
Fences and capturing key bridges to stop any German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Early the next morning, the barrage came, as Allied ships fired a huge number of shells at the German fortifications, and then the landings. The Americans at Utah and Omaha, the British at Golden Sword, and the Canadians at Juneau. It was a tremendous struggle with a great loss of life, particularly at Omaha, but the Allied troops captured the beaches, and the landings were a success. Then they began their movements inland. They took the port of Cherbourg and the city of Caen. The Americans moved south to capture Brittany. Then, in a massive disaster for the Germans, British and Canadian troops from the north and Americans from the south trapped the German 7th Army in a near wipeout encircling movement. In August, Allied troops landed in the south of France to little resistance. On one beach, all they found was a Frenchman handing out champagne. Paris was liberated, and the Germans were pushed out of France as the Allies entered Belgium. In the Far East, the Allies started to push the Japanese out of Burma, as the Americans launched a two-pronged offensive in the Pacific.
Allies visuose frontuose, įgės tiesiog... Kas buvo, jeigu taip, kas buvo stipriausias ir geriausias, kaip čia, įrankis Allies? Nes Amerika, ten kaip suprantu, biškai, vėliau prisijungė į tą karą, bet kas buvo jų esminis pliusas, kai jie taip galėjo, tiesiog visuose frontuose, kur jie pasirodo maždaug, ten jie paima. Ir kas čia buvo technologinis advantažas? Ar jie tą laiką technologiją tiesiog kūrė, ar kas actually buvo pats pagrindinis technologija industrija? Ar jie tą laiką, kol prisijungė į tą antrą pasaulinį, nes kaip suprantu, biškai vėliau prisijungė, jie tą laiką vystė tą technologiją ir industriją, ar jie jau turėjo technologiją nuo pirmų pasaulinių ir industriją, ar technologija, resursai nenuvarginti karo, make sense, jo, jeigu vėliau prisijungė jų gamyklų, niekas nesprogdino, tas irgi true, ok. Ok. Technologiškai nebuvo pranašesnė? Ok. Tai tik po antro pasaulinio realiai tapo pranašesnė technologiškai, nes dabar kaip suprantu Amerika, smarkiai technologiškai pranašesnė. Už beveik jaučiu ten visus, ne?
In the South, General MacArthur led the push to liberate...
Čia yra OverSimplified. I guess, čia tiem, kuriem įdomu, į tos klausimus, kurie man čia kyla, I guess yra 50 kitų valandos ilgio video, žinai, kur eina giliai į tas temas, ten ir technologinį advance ir panašiai. Čia aš gal nenorėčiau detalių jau, tipo, man nereik norėti yra detalių. Bet čia jau karas link Japonijos einas.
Hard-fought landing on fiercely defended small islands as they moved steadily towards the Japanese mainland. The Japanese believed that the greatest thing a person could do was to die in battle, and the most dishonorable act was to surrender. As a result, they fought ferociously to the very end, and the closer the Americans got to the mainland, the more ferocious the resistance became.
Bet, tipo, man, aš kaip apie tą mąstau, tipo, kiek daug žmonių tiesiog mirė. Tame man yra turbūt žiauru. Ir Einšteinas, pavyzdžiui, jis, revoliuciškai mąstė. Jos smegenys, kažkas jos smegenyse buvo šiek tiek kitaip, kai jisai, išmąstė tos dalykus, kuriuos išmąstė, kur niekas kitas net įsivaizduoti negalėjo, jis įsivaizdavo, žinai. Ir kartais galbūt reiktų vieno Japono, kuris kare mirė. Kuris jeigu būtų gyvenęs, jeigu be karo galėjęs ten mokytis ir panašiai. Ir jo galbūt smegenys buvo tokios, kuris būtų išradęs kažkokį mediciną, bet kur, žinai. Kažką breakthrough, žinai. Man tas turbūt yra didžiausias argumentas, kodėl aš sakau, kad greičiausiai būtumėm netgi dar greičiau advansinę visas technologijas į priekį, jeigu nebūtų to karo tipo geno, aš čia vadinu karo genų, suprantat, kad turiu menį. Nes man atrodo, kartais reikia tik kokio vieno žmogaus, žinai, kur jisai pakeičia visą fieldą ir visą mūsų suvokimo pasaulio, žinai. O kiek daug žmonių mirė, kurie galbūt turėjo potencialiai šansą tapti tais, žinai, kurie pakeistų tą mūsų... Labas, Grablė.
In February 1945, the Americans captured the island of Iwo Jima, and an intense firebombing campaign of Japan's wooden cities began. The Allies suffered some setbacks trying to liberate the Netherlands, but they were making progress and were now threatening the industrial heartland of Germany. Hitler's health, both mentally and physically, was rapidly deteriorating. Things were looking bad, and he was desperate. He said, "We need to turn this thing around, and I have just the trick. Remember a few years back when we blitzkrieged through the Ardennes and trapped the Allied forces in Belgium? Well, I'm going to do the exact same thing." Again, he gathered his forces and tried to pound them through the Ardennes. He used up the remainder of Germany's strength and resources, and he managed to create quite a nice bulge. He also trapped some American forces in the Belgian town of Bastogne. The Germans sent the trapped Americans a message saying surrender or be annihilated. When it was read out to the commanding officer, he said, "They want to surrender? No, sir, they want us to surrender." Nuts! And that's what they sent off as...
Aš tą prisimenu iš kažkur jau kitur, čia per daug kartojamas ta istorija.
Their official reply. General Patton's Third Army then managed to break the siege from the southwest, and the Germans were pushed back. Hitler's last-ditch attempt had failed, and what followed was a total collapse of the German forces. The Allies pushed into Germany from both sides. The Soviet Union took Warsaw and kept pushing to Berlin. In his bunker, Hitler realized all hope was lost. Berlin fell, and with it, Hitler's dreams of a great German empire. Two of the Axis nations had been knocked out.
Okay.
The Americans began their assault on
Here we go.
the last island before they reached the Japanese mainland. The desperate Japanese fought hard, launching kamikaze attacks on the U.S. ships. The citizens of Okinawa suffered through the terrible fighting, but in 2 months, the island was captured. The Allies now had to make a choice. either continue the devastating struggle up the Japanese mainland, or they could try to coerce the Japanese into surrendering now. In July, the first successful atomic bomb test took place in New Mexico, and the destructive weapon was ready for use. America and the UK were also...
Žinokit, nežinau, šitaip žiūrint, čia turbūt pats baisiausias dalykas, ką yra žmonija padarius ever, ir tai buvo amerikiečiai, nes čia tikrai čia unimaginable destruction, atominės bombos. Ir kaip pirmą kartą ir vienintelį kartą panaudojo, my fucking god. My god.
The Soviet Union not so much liberating as occupying its captured territories, and so they wanted to put on a show of force. On August 6th, the A-bomb fell on Hiroshima. Then, on the 9th, Nagasaki.
Beveik prediktinau, kaip paros, bet visur taip parodo, bet jo, Jesus, tą tokius sprogimus ant mapo, bet... Damn.
The cities were reduced to rubble, and for the people living there, it was a terrible fate. But for the Allies, it achieved their main aim. In September...
Kaip Japonai dabar beje šiaip kultūrai žiūri Ameriką? Ar jie laiko dėl šito neigiamą sentimentą? Jaučiu tokį dalyką būtų sunku pamiršti, ne? Nes čia, blėt, pizdės biški. Dabar šiaip, man atrodo, Japonija su Amerika gan friendly, kiek žinau, bet still, nežinau, turbūt prisimena dar vis tiek tą, bet damn. Girdėjau, kad kai kurie ten mano, kad bombos numetė sovietai? Ok. Tai vieną bombą nužudė tiek žmonių, kaip per kelias dienas žudavo dėl bombardavimų, tai jei karas būtų trukęs ilgiau nei 2 savaitės, tada būtų žudę dar daugiau žmonių. Kiek per savaitę? 100 000 per savaitę nuo bombardavimų mirdavo? No shot, ne? Vokiečiai turėjo labai gerą karo technologiją ir techniką. Tankai, haubicos, small arms buvo aukšto lygio, britų nebuvo nei prastesnės, nei geresnės. Kai kuri technika buvo netgi per aukšto lygio vokiečiams. Ginklai ir tankai reikalavo daug lėšų laiko ir buvo komplikuoti su sudėtingais mechanizmais. Sovietų strategija buvo visai kitokia. Sovietai rušino biokį.
The emperor announced Japan's surrender, saying the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. After 6 years, war was finally over. The Allies occupied Japan for 8 years. The emperor was allowed to keep his position, but General MacArthur made sure this picture was printed in the Japanese press to display to the Japanese people that their emperor was not the divine, powerful being they had believed. Germany was divided between America, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union. In 1949, the Allied sectors were united into West Germany. The Second World War had been more terrible and destructive than the first.
Damn.
In its aftermath, 2 major superpowers with 2 very different ideologies had come out victorious, and the tension between the 2 of them would create a new kind of war. A very, very cold one. Wow, Churchill, that looks just like me. And your app is doing really well. In this case, the deal you made is to die for. How'd you learn to do all this stuff?
Skillshare.
Use the link in the description to get 2 months of Skillshare.
Ok, šitas baigęs. Ok, man patiko šitie video. Komentatorius, kuris parekomendavo, buvo teisus. Čia buvo kieti video. Koks vakaras ilgas, kaip širdim man gelia. Nuskink man jazminą.